Okay, it's 5 after, so we can go ahead and get started. If you can just give me a thumbs up so that I know you guys can all hear me. Cool. Okay, so usual format, names, pronouns, and icebreaker, which for today will be since February is the month of love, what is one thing you love about yourself? Could be physical, could not be physical, up to you. And as always, I'll go first. So my name is Jonathan. My pronouns are he, him. And one thing I love about myself is how thorough I am. It comes in handy a lot. Comes in handy at work, comes in handy in my personal life. Sometimes it can be a bit of a double-edged sword because I'm not the most impulsive person, so I do take time to make a decision, but the decisions I take my time on are always very well thought out. So I love that. Who wants to go next?
I can go next. Hello, everybody. My name is Grace. My pronouns are they, them. And one thing that I love about myself is my resilience and adaptation to change. So, throughout my life, I've had to change and adapt quite a bit, and I'm having to do it a lot this past month. And it's nice being able to know that about myself, and that gives me a capacity to also help others whenever they're struggling a little bit more with change.
I can go. My name is Michael. I use he, him pronouns. And I think my favorite thing about myself is my curiosity. It definitely comes in handy in work and I guess my personal life too. But just not being afraid to question stuff or prioritizing that over being like overconfident. I like to think it's one of my strengths.
My name is Saul. I use he, him pronouns. I'm going to do a little different. I'm going to say what I like physically. I started to grow out my hair for the past like couple of months, and it's the longest that it's been for a while. And I love being able in the past few months to go dancing and like feel my hair dance with me. That has been really like joyous and something I haven't felt in a long time. So that has been really cool.
Well, that was also nice. I love the air of self-love we have going on. Okay, so I will, of course, ask, what did you all think of this month's book, Don't Cry for Me by Daniel Black? Any general thoughts you want to share?
Um, this is Grace. I thought it was so good. I knew I was in for it whenever I read the author's note, and the author's note was some of the most like powerful, impacting sentences. I think it also kind of like really resonated and like was a really beautiful book in a way that I wish I almost like the father, I wish I knew more about the son through the whole thing. I was like, oh my gosh, what's his life like? What's he doing? Um, and it just kind of reminded me of my relationship with my father quite a bit. So it was like very interesting because, yeah, we'll probably get into that later. But I just thought it was, yeah, some of the most impactful sentences. And I could probably, I don't really read books, but I could probably reread this book and just highlight sentences and think about them for like hours probably.
I also really like this book. Just as Grace said, um, it was so beautiful to read, and it was also so complex. Where at times, like I truly felt bad for Jacob, and then at other times, I just didn't like him, and like still felt this like if only you could have done this, or like if you got there. Um, so that just made him such a complex character to me. Um, that it was just really great. And I also had wished at the end that maybe we would have gotten like a letter from the son or something else. But I was also happy with how it ended.
So I went through the book twice, and I'm glad I did, because the first time I was maybe uh, like a little salty, or it was like a little too real, because my father figure was my grandfather growing up, who was born in the 40s, and very, very, very much mirrors like the life experience and attitude uh, of the father in the book, in like a kind of scary way. But I did go back a second time, and I appreciate it a lot more the second time.
Nice. Well, if it isn't obvious by me having read this book twice and, of course, signing it for the club, I loved this book. I think I might have shared this before, but if I haven't, this is the book that made me want to start this club. So this book will always have a special place in my heart because of that. Like a lot of you said, yes, Jacob is almost an exact copy of my father. Of course, my father's not this age, but in terms of his behavior, his beliefs, almost exactly the same. So much so to when I read the book the first time, I was like, I think this author knows me on a level that I don't even know myself. Because I just saw so much of my father and I's relationship in Jacob and Isaac's relationship. Um, I will say that this book is almost perfect for me. It just falls flat times. I do wish that we would have gotten more of the mother, Rachel. I feel as if she's the only character that's lacking, in my opinion, but I do think there's a strength in that, not having her fully fleshed out, because um, it's made apparent just how little Jacob knows about her. So, of course, when he's remembering her, there's only so much that he has to say. Um, I will also say I found it kind of maybe corny or annoying how almost everyone dies of cancer. I think that oftentimes dead parent stories rely on cancer a little bit too much. So I'll take off like a point or two for that. But I also really enjoy uh, reading a book that focuses solely on the relationship between a father and his queer son. I feel as if oftentimes in books about queer men, we focus solely on the mother. So it's definitely a nice change to get a story from the father's perspective. Also, like Saul said, I really appreciate the complexity that Daniel Black, this book's author, wrote Jacob with. I think oftentimes it's so common that we kind of disregard homophobia as this like simple stupidity or hatred. And this book shows that there are actually a lot of complexities that may result in someone being homophobic, or especially to their own child, to the point of like, I would think that Jacob does abandons his own child, emotionally at least. Um, so yeah, that's a lot, but obviously I love this book. So, okay, let's get into our like two main characters and then our side character. Let's start with Jacob. General thoughts on Jacob.
I think overall, although at times I was frustrated by his actions or thoughts, I mostly just felt bad for him. And I think that he said it multiple times throughout the book how it was the son who was free and he was not. And I really truly felt that throughout the book of him just being, I guess, burdened or held back by everything that he had lived through, all the social norms that he has had to comply to, that it really made me sad for him, to kind of read his reflection on his life. Um, yeah, so I did think that the letters were very healing for him, and hopefully would have been for the son as well.
Yeah. Kind of like what Solo said was, man, just what a complex character. Because I think it's really hard to sometimes be upset when you see people as children and like the abuses that they face, but then also realize that, you know, we were also children and so had to be, and we've been, I would hope, like better than our parents, or like more kind or more open or like more loving that potentially like his son would be. So it was, the character I think was, felt very human in the way that like he never really resolved things on his own end, and by the time that he did, he probably felt like it was too late, and that all he would had to do was kind of like put his ego to the side and speak up for his son, and he just couldn't do it just because of his own hangups and his own, you know, honestly just the way he was raised with that patriarchal mindset where he, not being able to love or not even be able to hug his son anymore, not because anyone forced him not to, just because he thought that it was like inappropriate for himself because of how he was raised and things like that. So I just thought it was like a really interesting character development. And personally, for me, his act of reading being a revolution for him, I think was really powerful and really changed fundamentally who he was. And I've always thought that about reading as well, is that when you read stories, it opens your mind to different possibilities. And reading's always been such a big part of my life. And so seeing someone not really reading at all and then reading, and that's pretty much the only reason I feel like he even remotely changed his mind about certain issues, like reading The Color Purple or, reading Malcolm X's biography. I just thought that was really, really powerful, for him to start to love himself in order to heal, to be able to maybe love his son eventually. Um, but yeah, so it's just such a well thought out character all around, because the other times where I was just like, oh my God, I don't like this person at all. And other times you just feel such like deep sorrow for that person, because you know that they like could have had a better life if only they would have just tried harder to like heal themselves. So
Mm. I did struggle with Jacob's like ego a lot, and like I do know like a lot of the growth that uh, Grace mentioned, but there are still a lot of times where I was like, he's actively like saying like, oh, this doesn't feel right, or like I I don't know. There's just a lot of things where it seemed like he knew but like wasn't trying to change or like push other people to change. And that inaction was a little hard for me to like get through at times, but it did make him seem very realistic, especially in the context, like the time periods and social situations which he's telling everything. So I did appreciate that, and I do, especially the reading was like such a cool thing to see develop, because because he talks about it at the beginning, and then like having it come back like late in adulthood, because he didn't get to like continue that education was kind of cool. But yeah, that's it. I'll stop there. Those are my initial thoughts.
Yeah, I agree with all of you, and I think we've said it already that Jacob is obviously a very complex character. And I love that the author wrote him that way. Especially, I believe it was you, Grace, who mentioned Jacob's growth throughout the story. I love that even at the end, maybe this is kind of messed up to say, but I love that even at the end, Jacob's homophobia is not cured. He's still struggling and trying to understand queerness, homosexuality, and what that means, especially for two men. And I think that's so realistic. Um, and perhaps that strength comes from so much of this book, I'm imagining, is mirrored throughout the author's relationship with his own father. Um, but yeah, I love that. I think that going into it the first time, I was convinced this was going to be a story about a father trying to understand queerness or trying to come to terms with his son's queerness. But I would argue that the book isn't really about that. It's more about the father trying to understand, I'm sorry, trying to accept and come to terms with who his son is and accept him for who he is, despite their differences, rather than trying to become this like woke liberal person towards the end of the book. Um, so I love that. Also, I love that you and Michael, Grace, you and Michael mentioned the reading in this story. I thought that was really important. And I noticed it for all of the characters in the book. And I'm curious if anyone else noticed the importance of reading, not just with Jacob, but with Isaac and Rachel as well.
Yes.
Yeah, and I thought it was really powerful that Jacob blamed reading for why their marriage fell apart because she started to realize that the patriarch has like complete and total control over her life. And then was like, this book is the problem. And then I think it was like Michael that said, um, Jacob's ego was getting in the way so much that it's like, no, maybe you're the problem or society's the problem, but it was like the book that was the problem at first. And so, like, that deep anger for knowledge that changed like his wife fundamentally, but also the deep, I guess, sorrow in himself that he didn't like read sooner or change sooner. It was like a really interesting dynamic about reading for sure, or just education in the way that, you know, ideas can sprout seeds. And that's something that Jacob mentioned, I think, in almost the last letter about like plucking the seeds that are weeds and like leaving the things that make someone like beautiful. So I just thought it was very, really cool to like add that dynamic in.
Yeah, I loved seeing reading as like an act of liberation. That was really cool to me. Like beginning with the mom, and later with Isaac, and then afterwards with Jacob. That was really impactful to me to be able to see. I guess right. I think maybe Jacob even said it at one point of once you start to learn, you really learn that you don't know anything at all. So that was really cool to be able to see him step out of what he thought he knew and the worldview that he thought was everything to then be like, wow, I actually don't understand a lot of why I am the way that I am.
Yeah. And I love that you brought up that quote, Saul. I think there's another quote that encapsulates that point perfectly. I think Jacob says, "Education sets the captive free," and I think that is perfect for this entire novel. Um, and I would even argue that for any of us who have similar experiences with our fathers or even our mothers, if this book mirrors you and your mother, um, learning about their story is able to set you free from the pain they've caused you. Um, and I truly believe that our healing lies in empathy. And I think that for all these characters, when they begin to empathize with each other, they're able to heal and move on, which is perfect. And I love, Grace, that you mentioned Jacob blaming the feminine mystique for his wife's like quote unquote disobedience. Um, that was funny. Um, I'm curious, did any of you guys notice how often Jacob's feelings and behavior stemmed from his desire to have approval from other men in his life?
I mean, it seemed like a lot to me. Um, and the one situation, I'm going to jump to like one of the saddest parts of the book, but with the little boy with the long eyelashes, why can't I remember his name? At the school where like Jacob is like kicking him, while the other boys are like doing their like inappropriate abusive thing, but him still participating, like just for the sake of approval, and sort of like seeing that come through so early on in life seemed to have like really impacted the way that he approach those kind of situations. And I just like what a turning point that could have been. Like what a different story if he had like stood up maybe. But no, I did notice that. So yes.
Yeah, to me, it seemed like it was a big driving factor for a lot of the stuff that he did from the very beginning, like Michael mentioned, to all the way to the very end. Like I said, relates to his coworkers and how he had mostly stopped sharing about his life because he was ashamed of Isaac. And even, I think that you said this earlier, Jonathan, that he's not like he hasn't fully gotten rid of his homophobia. Like he still is harboring a lot of discomfort in it. So even when his coworker comes and tells him about his son being attacked, where that could have been a place to heal together, he still wasn't able to kind of share that out. So that might be less of like trying to impress somebody, but still, I think the um, just the need to maybe not be fully seen either, right? Um, really kept him back.
Yeah. Well, I feel like it just like started with, like the grandfather and then the kids at school and then yeah, like the coworkers and then, yeah, like there's like so many moments that could have been like so healing and freeing, but it was almost like this worry or um just about the status quo and what it meant to be a man. And I think I'm trying to remember like what letter, but he was talking about like what being a man is supposed to be or and that it's changed so much now. And I just thought that was like a really interesting critique on your identity, like his identity with other men, but that those identities are ever changing because there's no such thing as just like what a man is. Um and just talking about how, this is how it was for me then and now it's so different now. I just thought that was like a really interesting take on the relationships between all the men in the book too, and how I forgot what the person's name was now, but when they were all arguing at the postal service, and how it almost seemed like there was that one man that they all looked up to because he seemed contrary to the things that people were saying. It was like more apt to fight for what he thought was right. And I thought that was really interesting that the person that everyone really liked the most was the one that was actually kind of going against the grain and trying to like fight the status quo and like liberate people. So I thought that was kind of interesting, like the dynamic of all those men at that job. Um, yeah.
Go ahead, so.
I also did think it was interesting that although like maybe as a reader, maybe today, right, we're looking at him and being like, why couldn't you just stand up and like not be led by what other people thought? But then he was validated in a lot of times throughout the story about the way that he felt. So like when Isaac performed in that musical and he was not okay with that. And then later hearing people leave the theater being like, I would never let my son do that. So, like, yes, the way that he was feeling might have been in his head sometimes, but a lot of the times it really was reinforced by the people around him. So, even though he might have been doing something for the sake of other people, it really wasn't in his head sometimes. Like sometimes the backlash was very real, and it could also have been, we're not sure how real it was for Isaac as well, but it could have also, right, in what Jacob kept saying that he was trying to protect Isaac, that sometimes it was the reality of that, even though the way that he was protecting him was only causing more harm.
Yeah, I agree with all of you, and I believe it was Michael who said it comes up several times throughout the novel. Probably throughout it is it encapsulates Jacob's entire life, this desire to seek approval from other men in his life, and to live up to this like traditional idea of masculinity. I love, Saul, that you brought up the play. That's where I was gonna go next. Um, I think it's interesting how before the play is over, Jacob gets up and goes to the bathroom out of like embarrassment or discomfort, whatever. And it's not until he comes out and hears the other men saying how angry they would be that he actually becomes angry. I would have been curious to know, would he have been so angry and physically violent with Isaac had he not heard the other men say that? Um, and then I'm also reminded of the moment in the restaurant where Isaac puts the napkin over his lap, or is it on his shirt? One of those. He does something with a napkin. And it's because Jacob is able to see other men staring at them that he hits Isaac. Um, Whereas before, he probably wouldn't have said anything. Because I believe in that same moment, he says that would be okay at home, but it's not okay in public. Um, so, yeah, that comes up a lot throughout the entire story. I'm curious, do you think, considering that this story's main character is straight, um, but I would argue that Jacob's story revolves around Isaac, would you consider this to be a queer novel at all?
Um, for me, I would say yes, because there's a part of me that wonders how straight Jacob actually is. Because I don't know, I would like to hear everyone's thoughts on the when he said that he saw like his brother. I don't know, the whole scene with like his brother taking a bath. I thought was very interesting because he was like appreciating his brother's physique. And I just thought that was like a really weird detail to add in, and about how that's like the first and only time he's ever really truly like loved someone who like passed away. And so I feel like to me, this is a queer novel because this is someone who's having to deal with identity throughout his whole life, and potentially somewhere, maybe potentially could have been queer themselves, but was so status quo and having to get the approval of other men so drastically that, I mean, I don't even know if that would even be at the forefront of Jacob's mind, like at all, or being able to go there. And just the scene with like him catching his son kiss his boyfriend was also a very interesting scene, because it's there was not like jealousy, but almost like a hint of like peculiarity of like, I couldn't imagine that, but I don't know. Just anytime that there was an interaction that he truly saw between like a man or men, and he was fully alone and didn't have to deal with the other men in society being around, it almost seemed like he would either be okay with it or is curious himself about himself, but could never really know himself in that way because he just wouldn't ever let himself go there. And I'd just be curious what other people thought about that too, in the guise of this being a queer novel or not.
Oh, go ahead, Michael.
Oh, okay. Thank you. So I don't know if I have an answer to your actual question, Jonathan. Like when I think of a queer novel, like obviously it's something that like details, what's unique or what's not unique, what's something normal that everyone goes through that's part of a queer experience. Um, and since it's really like all about Jacob, um, I'm not sure, but I did have some like similar thoughts that Grace did, because a lot of these things that Jacob associates with like femininity or frailty or queerness are things that he like kind of was like into as a kid or exposed to and then like pulled back from or was forcefully pulled back from. Like he was going to school and learning to read when he was a kid and like he was in the kitchen baking and cooking and stuff and like hanging out with his grandma. um so I don't know, that was interesting. And the same thing that Grace said, like with when he saw Isaac kissing the other guy, like I was a little bit surprised there was not like a more violent reaction or just like him like turning around and ignoring it. But like taking that pause and really just like taking in the moment is kind of curious. Given some of his like other attitudes, even though there are no other people around, so like it's not, that part's not motivating him, but it did like make me wonder just a little bit, like Jacob have like some part of himself he wanted to explore but didn't get to. And the thing with the weird thing with the brother, that too I did not understand, of like I didn't get what that was or what that was supposed to be telling us, and if that was like an indication that of maybe like Jacob's queerness, then yes, I guess.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I would consider it a queer novel either. I think it does have queer aspects to it. Um, but I'm not sure if I would. I really, maybe I would, maybe I wouldn't. And then two, for kind of the other topic, I mean, I inherently think that everybody's a little gay. But I do think that with Jacob specifically, that maybe it was more of just a lack of love, that the only perception of maybe love that he had seen is this romantic love and not something necessarily right that he was being given by his grandfather, and that maybe that he was given by his brother, and the only thing that he could equate it to was this romantic love that he had seen, married people have. So that's kind of how I took it, that there was a lot of times, or kind of throughout his whole life, that Jacob was just simply deprived of love, of physical affection, that wasn't romantic, that wasn't sexually motivated, that he couldn't fathom this other type of love, right? Even when one of the things that really was painful for me, one of the scenes was when him and Isaac were back in Alabama, and he tried to show him how to skip rocks, and like touching him wasn't even something that he could felt comfortable doing. And that was really sad to me, again, because he felt inappropriate doing that, because maybe the only type of touch that he had seen be appropriate is between a man and a woman, and for kind of romantic sexual feelings. So this kind of just tenderness he really couldn't allow himself to have. And maybe that's similarly when he saw Isaac kissing somebody else, that it was such a tender moment in a type of, like, between two people that he could have never conceived that happening, um that really kind of blew his mind, and was like, wow, like, I didn't think that this was possible. And I think he also, with his separation from his wife, that he really was just fully deprived of that physical love, of that touch, of that tenderness, that I think he was jealous of Isaac being able to have that.
To answer my own question, I do think that I am, like a few of you, a little bit torn on whether or not this would be a queer novel. I think this book teeters the line perfectly of a queer novel, or like, I guess, a straight novel. Um, but I think I would probably consider it to be a queer novel simply because so much of the story revolves around Isaac's queerness. But I believe it was Grace who also mentioned it revolves a lot around identity. Um, And I think that is, while not inherently a queer experience, struggling to come to terms with who you are, I think it's something that majority of queer people do experience probably more than heterosexual people. Um, so yeah, and Grace and all of you really brought up the moment where Jacob is watching his brother Esau in the bath. Um, I wasn't really sure about that moment either. I wasn't sure if it was some sort of like potentially like sexual moment or if that was like a typical sibling thing. I'm an only child, so like I wouldn't know what that dynamic feels like, but I could also imagine um I could imagine having an admiration for your older sibling, and maybe a sense of like curiosity or even mm, maybe you'd call it jealousy towards the way they look and the way how much they're liked and all of that. And I don't know if any of you guys in here have siblings, but as an only child, I'm curious, is that what that dynamic feels like, the older sibling and the younger sibling?
Oh, go ahead, Michael.
Oh, you can go ahead.
Well, I'm the youngest, but I'm also in my family, but I'm also the youngest by quite a few years. So like by 10 years and like 6.5 years. So, I mean, for me, I never really felt a jealousy for my older siblings. It was more of a yearning to be with them all the time. Wanting to just hang out with them or grow with them, and then them just being absolutely not interested in you at all because you're like the youngest sibling and they want to do their own thing. And then a lot of times parents would force siblings like together, at least mine did, to hang out, and then kind of feeling like a third wheel. Because my two oldest siblings were really close in age by like only like 2 or 3 years. So yeah, yeah, and that's why the dynamic of, like the bath scene with the brother was very interesting to me because I couldn't really place why that was also there or why Jacob would want to bring that up because everything that Jacob has brought up in the story had to do with him kind of like finding himself or explaining, like maybe explaining why he did what he did in certain times of his life. So that's just from his perspective of a younger sibling, that it's mostly just a yearning to be a part of the family and wanting them to pay attention to you and think that you're great, usually. And then you get to a certain age that, you go through the don't care about anybody phase and that you're real cool, and then going back to wanting to just hang out and be friends with your older siblings.
Yeah, I was going to say that I am the older sibling, and that I did grow up with a lot of cousins and am the oldest male cousin. Um, but I don't remember having any like experiences like this, and I don't know if like part of that was just like me as a like queer child really avoiding. But I will say that like the like being forced to like bathe together, like be in those sort of situations, did seem pretty normal. I don't know if that's just like a like country thing or like a poverty thing, but that did feel normal. But like the part of like the almost longing and admiration is not something I really like connected with or have my own experience.
I'm also an only child, so I do not know.
I love that you, Grace, used the word yearning, I believe you said. It reminds me that I believe the point in Jacob mentioning that the bathing moment is to understand Isaac's queerness. I believe Jacob says, um, looking back at my relationship with my brother, I'm able to understand why two men would love each other because at one point I loved a man, um, which I totally forgot about. But I think that shower moment now makes a lot more sense. Um, yeah. And I guess in some ways, there's a lot of, I would argue that a lot of the reason why men, whether they be heterosexual or not, don't show each other affection is because they're afraid of it being perceived as queer. Um, so yeah, I think I forget who mentioned it, but someone mentioned Jacob's jealousy towards Isaac. And I would agree. I think he's jealous of the ways in which he has loved other men in his life. But because of his heterosexuality, he hasn't been able to express it freely as much as Isaac has. Now, I'm curious, did you guys notice any hypocrisy in, no, let's save that question. First, did you notice any similarities between Jacob's grandfather's behavior and Jacob's behavior with Isaac?
Yeah, definitely. I was almost waiting for when Jacob was learning more about his mother for it to be revealed that his mother was also gay. So I was like thinking that that was what the guy was going to say. But it definitely was very much parallel of of Jacob's grandfather trying to break the spirit of his mother, just as Jacob was trying to do to Isaac, even if maybe not to that level or in his mind to that level. But it seemed very similar in kind of just like history repeating itself and um, really Jacob doing what he was taught to do and not being able to really break out of this cycle until much later in his life of causing this pain, thinking that you're doing it for the betterment of your child.
Yeah, I also noticed a lot of similarities just in the way that they just like really accepted like, oh, this is like what we're supposed to do. We're just like, it sucks, but we're not going to question it. Um, or just like blindly go with some things that didn't necessarily seem to make sense. And that's sort of just like the ego again, definitely in both of them, especially with like when the grandpa had the surgery and he was like, I'm gonna come out here and make my own breakfast and go to work. I don't care if I like die in the field because that's what it means to be a man. Um, there's like a lot of that similar sort of attitude in Jacob, and that made me see a lot of similarities, even if like their specific actions or experiences weren't exactly the same.
Yeah, I really was interested in the grandfather because I feel like, he idolized his grandfather, but at the same time was very afraid of his grandfather. So I feel like that came in and out of the story a lot. So, like during the funeral, how people were saying how wonderful his grandfather was. And I think it was like in his head, or he exchanged looks with his wife, saying, like, well, he was actually kind of terrible. But no one's going to say that at someone's funeral or something like that. And I think it was really interesting that he self-reflected in the contrast whenever he was beating on his son, and then was thinking about like what his grandfather did. That was the same. Um, and I think it did kind of come full circle when he finally got to understand what happened to his own mother, and then realizing he grew up without a mother kind of because of the fault of the grandfather, and how to reconcile that and the fact that his grandfather blamed her for what had happened to her and not the fact that it was all the men in her life that were just terrible to her, just because she wanted to be herself. Um, and I remember in the story that he wanted to be friends with a girl, I think in childhood, but he said that like he couldn't do it because his friends wouldn't let him or something like that. And it just kind of made me think about the whole situation, the dynamic between how much he was like his grandfather, but um, dissimilar because he did move to a city, um, and then the way he treated his wife, and the way his grandfather treated his grandmother, kind of towards the end of the book, was a very interesting way to kind of tie in, I think, family trauma and how those things get passed down. And I think that really coincided with Jacob's want to tell his son to not do the same thing that he did to somebody else, which I think was kind of like a revelation for him that, like my grandfather did this, I did this, and so it's up to you to not do that to somebody else and to stop what like I didn't stop. I think was a really interesting part of the book when he got to the end. And I think the most powerful letter per se, like the wrap up was definitely like the last one. Like I reread the last letter probably like 3 times and just got so much out of it. And tied it back into the whole situation about just these family bonds and how much family can traumatize us, but then also makes us who we are.
Yeah, I agree with all of you. I would think one of the book's most prevalent themes is generational trauma. And I think that there are so many similarities between Jacob's grandfather and Jacob. And it's interesting how much Jacob, when he's younger, is able to say, like, I hated my grandfather because of the way he behaved. Yet he becomes exactly like him and isn't really able to understand how that could result in Isaac hating him. There are several times throughout the story where Jacob is actually confused as to why Isaac wants nothing to do with him, um, which I just thought was so interesting. Um, I think sometimes people become what they hate and just can't see it. And I think that was what Jacob was dealing with throughout majority of the novel. I would even argue there are a lot of similarities between Jacob's grandfather's marriage to Jacob's grandmother, of course, and Jacob's marriage with Rachel. Um, I don't think that Jacob's grandfather was as abusive to his wife as Jacob was to Rachel, but I think that was because Jacob's grandmother understood if she didn't, quote unquote, stay in line, then he would become abusive. Because there were several times throughout the story where Jacob's grandfather and his grandmother would have a disagreement, and then his grandfather would give her sort of a look, and she would immediately like stop talking because she knew what could happen next. Um, and while we're here talking about marriage, let's talk about Rachel, uh, Jacob's ex-wife. Any general thoughts on Rachel?
I felt really bad for Rachel, um, sort of for like the same reasons that like Jacob behaved in the way that he did. She really didn't have a lot of opportunity to do what she needed to do for herself. That was unfortunate. It was really nice to see, like at some points, her like really standing up to him. Especially one of my favorite parts in the book is when he like yells at her and he's like, don't disrespect me in front of my son," and she like yells back and she's like, "Don't disrespect my son." I was like, okay. I was like, go Rachel, like she's still in there. But um no, I would have loved to have seen if like some other things could have happened, but like unfortunate reality of all of this. And I didn't really like the parts of her like neglecting Isaac. That was not cool. Um, but I did like some of the like growth and her coming into her own at the end.
Yeah, I completely feel similar to Michael. I really like Rachel and felt really bad for her. As it seemed right that when she didn't get to go to college, that really cost her a lot. And I think like all the characters, it just makes me sad how not free they were to be themselves, to pursue what they wanted to pursue, um, and understood why she then relied on drinking or how that she used that to soothe or to cope. Um, Another thing that I found interesting that really surprised me was that when Isaac decided to come out to her, that she was not okay with that, because I thought that that wasn't gonna be a plot line at all. I thought that he was gonna come out to her and that she was gonna be accepting of that, since she had been accepting of Isaac and how he was, generally in his life. So I was in Jacob's mind, almost being more confused, like Jacob was. So that was also an interesting thing to me, that maybe even diffused how Jacob felt, because maybe if Rachel hadn't been or had been supportive, Jacob could have taken more of a fighting stance towards that, but maybe because that was so confusing to him as well, that he was more confused than upset. And I do wish that, um, maybe by the end, and I not to say that Rachel didn't have a fulfilling life, but I do wish that more could have come from her life for her, so that she could have also really been able to pursue what she wanted.
Yeah, I thought Rachel was a really interesting character and a really interesting mother. And I was just thinking about being Isaac and how betrayed I would have felt that my mother was like supportive almost all the time. And then the minute that I thought that I could rely on her and come out to her, like, I don't know, that just felt like more of a betrayal than like his dad. And I was really disappointed in Rachel, like for doing that. And I was always curious if they ever reconciled later and that, Jacob didn't know about it because he doesn't really talk to his son. And I really wish that, yeah, that she would have maybe pursued college like later in life or, or done something a little bit more fulfilling that she's always wanted to do now that she was kind of like freer, and not having to rely on like a man in her life as much or having to take care of a child as much. And I don't know, it just very interesting seeing the dynamic between the the father, the son, and the mother, and then seeing like Jacob go to that, I think it was like the Color Purple book signing, and then seeing a white mother that was out and loud and proud about her child's lesbianism or being a lesbian. And I thought his reaction to that or being there at the book signing, that whole situation was very interesting. And how he mentioned, so I'm trying to think of the exact quote about, like maybe that's just like a white person thing or something like that. I thought that was a very interesting dynamic to kind of bring it in because we are kind of talking about, like this predominantly like black family and, like how that relates to each other. And then the bookstore was very interesting to me and kind of how I felt like Rachel wasn't there, but like they both read the same book and then kind of talked about it. And then he felt guilty for the things that he's done to, I think, women and for women throughout his life because of that book. And how that kind of tied back into like Rachel feeling more seen and heard towards the end of her life. I don't know. Rachel's a very interesting character, and I just felt really upset the way that she acted whenever her son came out. And I wasn't expecting that at all. So it was really weird to be confused along with Jacob, like what Sel was talking about. Um, yeah, I don't know. Rachel just kind of sometimes confused me. Um, with the way, but I don't know if that confusion was because it was we're not getting it from Rachel's lens either. We're only getting it from one point of view of someone writing a letter based on what they've noticed and what they experienced.
Yeah, I agree with all of you. I did like Rachel. I will say that I'm not sure that her reaction to Isaac's coming out confused me as much, just because how much Rachel's relationship with Isaac at least in the early stages of Isaac's life. Reminds me of my own mother, and I'm like, my mother had a very similar reaction, so I wasn't really surprised. What I would have loved from that moment is if the author would have really delved more into, or Jacob, I guess, not the author, would have delved more into questioning why Rachel's reaction was like that. Um, all I could think of was that Rachel was reading The Feminine Mystique, and that book is very homophobic. The way it talks about lesbians and queer men is definitely problematic. And I could only imagine that would be uh, why she is so against Isaac being queer. Um, because I don't believe that Rachel was ever a very religious woman. So, and she also never mentions religion as a reason for why she thinks it's so wrong or so sick or whatever. Um, so I would have loved to know that. And now that we brought up The Color Purple, I'm interested. I would have been interested to hear Rachel's reaction to reading The Color Purple because The Color Purple, they're obviously lesbians. So why would she be so upset with her own son being queer, but then she obviously loves The Color Purple? So that was a little bit confusing to me, but yeah. And I know we were talking a little bit ago about generational trauma, and just how much our relationships can mirror our parental figures' relationships. I would have been curious to know if Rachel came from an abusive home, and if her mother potentially was this like dutiful housewife who was abused, or if even Rachel was abused by her own father. Um, and maybe that's why she was willing to stay in an abusive marriage for so long. Um, I would have loved that. But again, we get so little of Rachel, unfortunately. But yeah. Did you find a hypocrisy in Jacob admiring his own mother's independent streak, but then also hating it in his own wife?
I definitely felt that, and I think maybe it comes from learning about his mother later in life, now that he felt differently about things that he had in the past, but maybe it also was because his mother was not being bold against him. I think a lot of the time when he was angry at Rachel or at Isaac, he took that personally as like, you're doing this and it's making me seem like less of a man. Whereas in his mother, by his mother being the way that she was, that didn't necessarily impact his manhood in a way. And again, maybe it's because his mother wasn't around for a lot of the time. But it was definitely, like you're saying, that there's he's kind of being a hypocrite in that sense, um, of admiring that, but maybe later in life he also came to terms with admiring Rachel's way of being. The other thing that I wanted to bring up, that this question wanted or made me think about was when he was telling the story of his family, like, of when they were freed and bought that land in that family dynamic in that mansion in the woods. The girls were also like hunting and like doing everything else that the boys were doing, and he also kind of said that proudly, or that was something that the family was praised for. So that was also interesting to see that, like, at that point it was okay for, girls to be this way, but maybe it was also because they didn't, um maybe like go against the men in the family. So even though they might have been doing more manly, quote unquote, things, they weren't challenging the men. So that was interesting to be able to say, like, from generation to generation, how that changed.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting too that his mother fought back against men twice and then eventually lost her life. One was like severely injured and then eventually, yeah, lost her life. And so I'm wondering if maybe that's why he was proud, is because as he was moving through his life and he was older and starting to understand, like, because at the very beginning of the book, he was talking about how Rachel's drinking was probably because she was never able to go to college, even though she was way smarter and was very capable and could have done really wonderful things. And so I'm wondering that at that stage in his life, when he learned out about his mother, he was proud of her because he knew of the cost of being um, free, I guess, in like all sense of freedom, and that, you know, that she lost her life because of it, because she wasn't willing to not be exactly who she was. And so maybe that's where it wasn't, maybe it was hypocrisy, but more of like a his growth and understanding, um also women's roles in this in society, and how like it was affected by men, and then his role in society and how it was affected by men, and, you know, wanting to do right by her, and then just kind of realizing what he's done in his life to the women in his life, um, and that maybe it was more of an acknowledgement of being proud because she never backed down from herself, where maybe he has in his life. Um, and Rachel backed down, but also didn't in a lot of times. And I think one of my favorite times for Rachel was whenever she got the kitchen knife out and like protected like her son. And I was just like, yeah, Rachel, you go, Rachel, you know, and that, you know, she was standing up for herself finally. And that maybe, you know, he was kind of acknowledging and kind of seeing the parallels between those two things too. And actually kind of getting that story together.
I don't have anything else to add to like answer your initial question, Jonathan. I do really like the points brought up about like him just not knowing or understanding until much, 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 much later in life, like what really happened to his mother. And it makes me wonder, did like somebody withhold that information to like make sure that he didn't, I don't know, have some sort of like admiration for strong women or something like that? Because there are a couple points in the book where he encounters these sort of more independent women or women that just like aren't fitting into um like necessarily the stereotype, and like sometimes it's okay, but a lot of times there's like hesitancy. And I think back to the school scenes where there's like the one girl that like plays with all the boys, and he's like, oh, like I like wanted to be friends with her, but you know we didn't like really do that because she was a girl. And that just sort of like seems to play out over and over again, you know, obviously with Rachel, but um, sometimes in other parts of the story too.
Yeah, I agree with you guys. I do think there is a certain level of hypocrisy there. Um, but I think by the time we get to hear Jacob's mother's full story, I think he's able to appreciate Rachel more, realizing that essentially, at least in some ways, he married his mother. So he got to know her, even if it was only through Rachel. Um, so yeah, maybe that kind of fixes his hypocrisy, but I don't know. Do you think that? No, go ahead, Soul.
I was gonna say that I quite didn't like the way that he explained how he wanted to marry a woman like Rachel and not just somebody who like wasn't like very submissive. Like he wanted it submission to be a choice. That I didn't quite like. Of, oh, you want the strong woman with opinions, but you still want those opinions to be your own. So that like fully didn't make sense to me. And then again, kind of comparing the situation to his grandmother, who he saw as maybe somebody strong, but who chose to um to kind of bow down to the grandfather. And to me, like the grandma, I mean, sure, maybe she had a choice, but she didn't really have a choice. So I quite didn't like that from Jacob.
Hmm. That's an interesting point. I didn't consider that. I'm curious to know whether or not, or I guess curious to know if you guys, what you guys think of this. Do you think that Rachel viewed motherhood as a trap? I believe it was Grace who mentioned that Rachel's drinking started after she had Isaac. And while, yes, of course, that's very likely postpartum depression, but I think it also could be her realizing now that, taking care of Isaac solely relies on her, um, that she'll never have the chance to go to college. That dream is done. And then there's a point where Jacob and Rachel are arguing, and Rachel says something like, I will never have more children by you. I took care of it, quote unquote, each time I was pregnant. Um, do you guys think that Rachel viewed motherhood as a trap?
I think she viewed it as an obligation, or something that like took away her opportunity, and that she probably like knew in her head, I'm gonna have to be a parent at some point. Um, but having it like come so early just ruined her, unfortunately, for a long time.
Yeah. And I don't know if it was like a trap per se, but I think because of the societal norms, she knew that it like completely decimated, I think, her autonomy because Jacob mentioned in the book, like, he doesn't take care of kids. He goes to work and comes home, and like, that's women's work. And so when she was like, you're going to look after my son when I go to like the women's shelter, he was just like, had no idea what to do. And so I think, maybe if Rachel was here today, it wouldn't have felt like such a trap if, she was with somebody that actually helped around the house or helped with the children as should be like an equal partnership, but because everything solely relied on her. And I don't even think Jacob ever, I mean, besides her dream of going to college, I mean, Jacob really didn't care about what Rachel wanted, it seemed like, at all. Because even whenever he was talking about Rachel, like, women like this house, all women should like the house that I buy. And so he didn't even ask her about the house before he bought it. And so I don't think she was really asked anything. Like, do you want to be pregnant? Do you want to wait? Do you want to, get help? And so I think that is more was what was the trap of the traditional women's role of the time was the trap and not necessarily having a child, because it seemed like she enjoyed having a child, but she didn't enjoy the entrapment of motherhood, of what that is supposed to mean and what you're supposed to do with it at the time.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think if it was a different time, if it was now, somebody could have a child and later go to school. But I think, I mean, when the story first started and we learned that she got into Oberlin, I was like, oh my God, like that is amazing. Like, not only is she a woman, but she's a black woman. Like in this time, like that is so, that's a rarity for that to be a possibility for people. Um, Whereas like if it wasn't then that she was gonna do it, it truly was going to be never. And she, I think, definitely knew that once she learned that she was pregnant, she's like, okay, that dream is dead. Then this will be the rest of my life. And it was something that she wasn't particularly looking forward to.
Okay, now let's talk about Isaac. General thoughts on Isaac.
I very much related to Isaac of just living a life where like behavior is corrected, like this natural behavior or personality that you have just being corrected um, to fit this other norm. So his story was very relatable. Um, and like every character, I felt bad for him. Um, it truly, like, even though we were learning about Jacob and how bad he felt for his actions, to me, I was like, well, that wouldn't make me feel better. Like, yes, understanding you will bring some clarity, but like the pain and the hurt is still there. And Jacob did acknowledge that as well, that maybe this is not going to take the pain away, but that hopefully it just brings some more understanding to why things happened. Um, yeah, so I liked Isaac, and I didn't expect him to like. I guess I'm just thinking about this now, but there wasn't a point for me where I expected him to like fully stand up to his dad. That was not something that I was expecting was going to happen, which it didn't happen. Um, and that what he did is also something that is very like similar to what I've done, which is just leave, and not necessarily keep this connection. Um, Maybe because in Isaac's mind, um, even trying to start that relationship with his dad again would only bring hurt, even if like maybe the hurt is only at the beginning. Like to go through that is quite painful again. So in mind, maybe he's really considering it. Is it really worth it? Is it really worth it to try to have a relationship with my father, um, even because I might encounter some pain from it.
Um, I find it a little bit hard to answer. I don't know why this is true for Isaac and it wasn't true for Rachel, but we really are only getting to see Isaac through Jacob's eyes. And I did find myself wondering, like quite a few times, like what is Isaac's interpretation of this, like same thing that happened, or like what what did he see or experience that we're not getting? Because I even think back to some of my own like formative family memories, and like I have a very different recollection than like my sister or my aunt or my mom or my grandma or whoever, um, of some of these things. So I wonder like how much of that is happening here and how much we really know of Isaac and how much is just his like father's interpretation of like, oh, here's this little boy that I like really struggled to like connect with and accept for a really long time, even though I like really loved him. But like how much of what he's saying is really coming from that, was hard for me to like reconcile at times. Um, no, but that's it. I guess I did appreciate like getting to see Isaac come into his own in quite a few things, and just like having the opportunity to like explore his sexuality and like be himself in a way that I wasn't sure would really happen, or that like wouldn't happen without him maybe like being like killed or something. Um, so that was good, but again, like all through Jacob's eyes sort of clouded it for me a little bit.
Yeah, Isaac, um, man, I was just, I really resonated with Isaac and just the experiences that, he would have on having to like hide or having to leave and like not talk to your father for any reason because there's just nothing to really say, right? And knowing that anytime that you did interact, it's just the same or stuff would just go unsaid because, his dad like could not say sorry for anything. And so, same for me, like I moved out at a really early age and I've been on my own for a long time and like I stopped talking to my parents for like 13 years. And just recently, as of like a month ago, I actually wrote my dad a letter by hand for the first time before reading this book, actually, because he went through his own growth, which is like a really crazy story if you know anything about my dad, but he went through his own growth. So he's the same age as the character in this book. My dad's like 64, and like had a huge turnaround, and I found out that he's been in therapy for 6 years, got on bipolar medication and ADHD medication, and has dealt with his childhood trauma, and then finally kind of reached out to my older sibling to reach out to me. So we're going to start having a conversation through letters and potentially like phone calls, but um it's just really interesting to see like the correlation there, because my father had very similar background to the dad in the story. And I feel like for Isaac, I just resonated with Isaac a lot, just growing up as a, just like as a queer kid in Missouri, because that's where I'm from, and kind of being raised in like an evangelical household, and then being told all these things are like bad or wrong with you all the time, or especially like the gender roles for, like AFAB people, especially in like those kinds of situations where I did not fit at all. I wouldn't really allow people to tell me what to do. And there was always like so much conflict there. And yeah, Isaac is just such a, I think, a powerful character in his own way because of his absence a lot. And I think there's a lot of strength for him to be able to walk away from that family and be who he is and go to Chicago and actually like have a boyfriend in Kansas City. It just was a really important thing. And I personally would have loved to have learned more about his side. So if there was like a second book just about like him reading these and like and his memories of that situation as well, I would absolutely have loved that. And so this book really came at a very interesting time. And so I was telling my spouse, I was just like, man, reading this is just so crazy at this time in my life as well. And just really thinking about Isaac's life and my life and how they're similar but very different, and like and what it means to like have a relationship with a really abusive father, and what that looks like later on in life if maybe your father has made some sort of amends either with himself or trying to with you, and like what that looks like, because like the father missed out on Isaac's entire childhood. So even though he was there, he even said didn't know his son like at all, didn't know his favorite color, didn't know anything about him, and so he really was just absent. um, and then his presence was also just like terrifying at the same time. So I really liked Isaac, and as much as you could get to know him, because his father didn't know him, and these letters are from his dad.
Like all of you, I really, really liked Isaac. Like Grace said, I relate to Isaac tremendously. I also love the like small detail of Isaac loving art so much as he is when he is a kid, but as he grows up and enters into like, college, the professional world, he chooses tech instead. Such a small detail, but I think that happens to a lot of artists. As you get older, even though it's your dream, you begin to realize there's really not much money in it. And unfortunately, we need money. So I loved that small detail. Um, I also, like you all said, I would have loved to learn more about Isaac, but like Grace just finished saying, we learn so little about Isaac because there's so little that Jacob even knows. And of course, the entire story is told through his perspective. So, as unfortunate as it is that we learn so little about Isaac, considering that the story revolves around Isaac, it makes the most sense. Um, now, let's talk about what I think confused me most about this book. What did you guys think of Isaac's ghost whispering, medium-esque abilities?
I don't know if I have an answer for that because it also confused me. I was trying to make sense of it every time that it happened, um, as to like why the author was deciding to put that in, or what maybe like culturally or like historically might mean. Um, because I'm not a very religious person. Um, so and maybe it's like more of a thing like in the South. I'm not sure. Um, but yeah, it was really interesting. And to me, maybe the way that I made sense of it was again like maybe more freedom that Isaac had, or the more connection that he had with himself, and then allowed him to connect otherworldly. Um, but I found that interesting, um, and it kind of made a little bit more sense, and it was very impactful when he was this wasn't maybe the same thing, but when he was talking to Rachel after she had passed and having that conversation back and forth that Jacob overheard, like that was really powerful. Um, but maybe that was a little bit different than when he was at the gravesite. But it did lead up, I think, to later the mother's storyline, or Jacob's mother's storyline.
Um, for whatever reason, it didn't make an impression on me because I forgot all about it until you just asked. Um, so I'm like trying to like think back and process a little bit. Uh, thank you guys for the humor.
I honestly didn't think much of it. I just thought it was a cute, quirky thing that Isaac could talk to ghosts. I was just like, he's he's gay, he can talk to ghosts, he's in IT. What can't Isaac do? I don't know. I just thought it was just kind of, we all have weird things about us, and then I guess his was he gets to talk to ghosts. So I just I I liked it because I just thought it was fun, but I honestly didn't even give it a second thought as it was happening. I was like, oh, he can talk to ghosts. Okay, cool. Next. So
Yeah, I still can't really make much sense of it. When I first read this book, and I saw Isaac's medium abilities, I was kind of pissed off. I was thinking we're gonna go down like some like ghost hunting kind of route with him, and I was not interested in that at all. Um, but I will say that while I'm not totally sure if I believe in mediums or not, I do believe that it's possible that some people are empaths and that your empathy for others can go so deep that you could feel things from people who aren't even alive anymore. I do think that is possible. And perhaps that's what Isaac is feeling, because Jacob says several times throughout the story that Isaac was very, very empathic, and that when someone cries around him, he cries, and he's able to sense things that people feel without them even expressing those feelings, all of that. So perhaps that's the point the author is trying to drive home. Um, I was a little bit curious, though, if Isaac has these ghost whispering abilities, how exactly do they work? We know that when Isaac is at the family gravesite or cemetery, he's able to communicate with Esau, with Jacob's grandmother, with Jacob's mother, but he never mentions Jacob's grandfather. So I was wondering, is there a reason why? Does Jacob's grandfather just not want to speak to Isaac? Um, how exactly does that work? And then we don't get any moments of Isaac speaking to Rachel until he goes into her bedroom. So perhaps his abilities are limited to being where that person was the most. And then he can talk to their spirit. Um, and I kind of finished the book wondering, and maybe you guys have thoughts on this too. Do you think that Isaac will be able to communicate with Jacob's ghost?
I didn't even think about that. Oh, sorry, go, Michael.
Oh, I was just gonna say that if him communicating with the other ghost is like a form of closure, then maybe not, because maybe the letters are like all the closure that they need. Because he didn't really get that sort of like deep communication resolution with anyone else, even though it is very one-sided, obviously. Um, but yeah, I don't know.
No, I was gonna say the same thing as you, Michael. That he maybe already heard everything that he was gonna ask or talk to Jacob about from the letters. But I do think with you, Jonathan, mentioning that he is like a very strong empath, that, and I think Jacob himself maybe even said this at the very end of the letters, that he hoped that Isaac would feel the feelings behind these letters. So maybe like being around wherever Jacob passed away, and then reading these letters there, that he really is able to feel this kind of sadness, shame, regret, like asking for forgiveness that Jacob really was trying to communicate. But I think the letters did a lot of that.
Yeah, just hearing everyone talk, it does kind of remind me of, like that deep empathy that was mentioned, and that, like when he went to the gravesite, he was really excited about learning about his family history from his father. And so wanting to have that closure with the family history might have then led to him having more that empathic feelings at the grave sites, and being able to ask like his father those questions, and then being in his mother's room. And so yeah, with these letters, and the fact that he didn't really talk to his grandfather at all, um, I'm not sure, but I'm leaning towards probably no communication needed at this time.
That's interesting that you all say that. The point about the closure, I'm curious now if Isaac is able to speak to these ghosts whenever he wants, or is it only to have, like I believe was Michael saying, a final closure sort of conversation? Um, because we only get him talking to each ghost once. But I do think, on the other hand, since it seems as if his abilities only work if he's in that person's, if he is where that person was most of their life, um, he's only in each of those places once as well. So I'm curious. Maybe he won't speak to Jacob, or if he can, maybe he can only speak to him when he goes back to the home that they shared as a family. Um, hmm. I guess I'm curious, did you guys get the sense that Jacob was sending Isaac these letters one by one, or did you get the sense that he was sort of keeping them as a diary and then sending them all together at the end?
I definitely interpret it as like one thing, like a collection all at once, and not sort of as like individual things. Even though they were dated, I still, in my mind, imagine like Jacob is writing these and then like filing them away, is sort of like his like final memoir, like last word, in one big thing.
Yeah, I would agree, just because there was really no, I mean, unless he was sending the letters and there was no response from his son the whole time, but because there was just a one directional verbiage, it felt like, and not like a, well, thanks for writing back or having any questions. It did feel kind of like more like a journal memoir that, that he was going to send or have dated to his son that was going to come pick it up whenever, he got informed that his father had passed away. It's kind of how I felt about it too.
Yeah, I was gonna say exactly what Grace said, Grace, about it. I also just looked and I was trying to, because you know how when you like read stuff, but you're not really registering. So I was trying to see like how long he was writing these letters for, and it went from like November to February. So it was only a couple of months. So it seems like maybe he was collecting them, knowing that he was gonna die, as this kind of the thing that he was leaving for Jacob, and maybe he didn't want, or sorry, that he was leaving for Isaac. Maybe he didn't want to see Jacob's response. I mean, sorry, Isaac's response. Um, like in between him telling the story, just because he kind of wanted to get it all out before there was kind of feedback or thoughts from Isaac.
Yeah, so now that you mention it, I like opened up the book and yeah, because I do the same thing where sometimes I'm just reading and I'm like, oh, I should probably look at the dates. At the beginning, it says, Dear Isaac, and then the very last letter says, Your father, Jacob. And so it's it's almost like that whole thing was like one big long letter um, that I didn't even notice before I kind of flipped to the first page and then flipped to the last page.
It's interesting that you say that, Grace, because I don't remember that either. I hadn't noticed that either. Yeah, I would say that it's probably most likely that he's sending them all together because, like a few of you have pointed out, that there's no mentioning of ever getting a response back, or even if he is being ignored, there's also no mention of ever being ignored by Isaac. Um, and especially considering the small detail that Isaac works at the post office. I'm sorry, Jacob works at the post office. I would think it wouldn't be hard to send the letters if that's what he was doing one by one. So it probably is most likely an all at once kind of thing. Since we're talking about the letters in a little bit more detail, I'm curious, do you see an importance in Jacob writing these letters as opposed to trying to speak with Isaac in person or over the phone? Or do you think that Jacob writing these letters was solely because he was too sick to physically see Isaac?
My first initial thought is that he can't get his words out at all anytime that he's tried to say anything, at least like from his letters to his son. He's always been like, I couldn't say it. I couldn't say it. Couldn't say it. And so I feel like this was like the only way for him to be able to say anything remotely meaningful without getting like garbled or just couldn't speak is what I got from that because he's just been unable to speak at all about his feelings almost it seems like his whole life.
I agree, Grace, and I also think of the letters too as like a really conflict avoidant way to just like get your thoughts out and not necessarily have to deal with whatever may come back. And also maybe there's some um, like knowledge on Jacob's part that like, oh, this is the like amount of energy like I feel like I have left. If I like get into this with Isaac, like maybe that will take the rest of my energy and then like I'll die not really getting to say everything I need to say. Because so many of the letters he's like, oh, I like can barely do anything, but I lifted my head up to write this letter today. So that did cross my mind a few times when I was reading them because I did think like why is there no back and forth or like acknowledgement from Isaac at all? But kind of how I justified it.
Yeah, I agree with both Michael and Grace about the reasons being kind of twofold of that I can't, like he physically can't say the words because of all the restrictions that he has lived in with his life, but then also maybe not wanting to have a conflict in that of not wanting to have to get defensive, right? He's trying to just explain his story and share his truth without having, and he is defending it at some times of the book, but without having maybe to defend it to what Isaac is saying.
Yeah, I agree with you guys. I love, Michael, that you said letters are very conflict avoidant. I agree. I'm trying to imagine if the same conversation, or at least if at least these conversations could be had at the same depth, if it was in person or over the phone. And I think not. I would imagine on the phone, because Jacob is so brutally honest, he says things that are, I would imagine from Jacob's perspective, would be very hurtful to hear your father say to you. Like several times throughout the novel, he calls Isaac disgusting. Um, and I would think from Isaac's perspective, if he heard that on the phone or in person, he would either argue back and cut Jacob off or hang up the phone. Um, and then, of course, like you all said, that whenever Jacob does try to be vulnerable with Isaac, he just gets so choked up that he can't get it out. So I think letters are really the only way he's able to be this honest. Without some sort of explosive conflict, and is able to get everything that he wants to say out. Um, yeah. And now I'm curious, considering everything that we know about Isaac, what do you think Isaac's reaction to these letters would be?
I think that he'd read them all and that he'd probably be impressed at like how much writing and vulnerability his dad was showing, but like in terms of an actual reaction, like is he going to be like upset or appreciate it or I don't, or like be in tears or like joyful? I don't. I'm not sure, but I do think he would read them.
Yeah, for me, just as I think that Jacob had an image of who Isaac was, that Isaac has an image of who Jacob was. So these letters could really bring him some clarity on that and a lot more understanding as to why his dad was the way that he was. Um, but I think that if I was me, I would have very conflicting thoughts and feelings about the letters, just as you were saying, Jonathan, like reading about Jacob calling him disgusting. At other times, he just says that he hates him or hates the way that he is. Um, or even sometimes, maybe even learning about the reasons why he was doing the things that he was doing, Jacob. Um, Maybe as Isaac, I would still be like, but I still wish that you would have tried harder. I just wish that you would have driven all the way to Chicago to come see me. I just wish all these different things. And I think it could bring some closure and at least, when going back and having to bury um, Jacob, maybe it would also give me a lot more understanding and appreciation of both the house that Jacob left him, but also of the land in Alabama that he left him, and then that might pursue him to be more connected with that family tree, rather than just kind of not.
Welcome in, Arian. We're just about wrapping up, but do you want to share your general thoughts on the book? Right now, we're talking about Isaac, but feel free
Um,
to talk about. Go ahead.
yeah, no, sorry. I I just woke up. I'm out of it. Um, I think I'll just take a backseat for this meeting for now. I'm sorry.
No worries, but feel free to jump in if you do have any thoughts to share. Um, what were we just discussing? Oh, reaction from Isaac to Jacob's letters. I think that Isaac, considering how empathetic he is throughout the entire novel, I think he would be, at the very least, open to reading them. Um, and I also think he would push himself to try and understand Jacob's point of view. Also, just knowing how much uh, Isaac reminds me of myself and my father's relationship. My father did something very similar. He had a stroke in 2020, and it was after that we hadn't spoken for a few years prior to that, because I chose to go no contact. But after that, he reached out to me and apologized. And of course, while I wasn't like totally ready to get on board and like be best friends, I was at least willing to listen. So I think that Isaac would do the same thing. Now that we're talking about Isaac's empathy, I'm curious, where do you think, in this book or even just in general, where do you think our desire to empathize with people crosses the line over into wanting to excuse their abuse? And I guess a follow-up to that is, do you think that Jacob is doing that, trying to excuse his abuse?
Um, I'll say, just like knowing from my own context and personal experiences, that I don't think Jacob really thought of a lot of what he did as abuse, more as like his like duty sometimes, like as a father or whatever. But I do think that he's trying to get across to Isaac that like, hey, I'm realizing now like some of this stuff like wasn't great, but like I don't think that I had like the tools to do better. Which I guess kind of is an excuse as I'm like talking through this out loud. But like when you're 23 with like a small child and like a drunk 19-year-old wife at home, and that's all you know, like what what else do you do? Um, so I'm not sure. That there's my not answer, half answer.
Yeah, I think from, a child's point of view, your parents are kind of like your world and the person that's supposed to protect you and love you. And you just have such a strong draw to your parents. And that as a child, having to remove yourself from that situation and rely on yourself has such it's a deep betrayal, I think, from your parents that you have to really learn to help yourself out of. And grow yourself and make sure you're not doing, the same things, and you're stopping the family trauma, and you're working on things. And, I think it a lot of times did for me read as an excuse, but also an explanation. And just from like my perspective with my own father, he was highly abused as a child. But then, at the same point, so was I, and I don't abuse people. And, and I've worked really hard to make sure I take care of people in my life. And I'm starting to be the age that my father was when I was born. And my father was also a young dad as well, was only 20 whenever he had my oldest sibling. And so just thinking about me at 20, what would I have done with a child? And then me at 30, and like, what would I have done with a child? And, being older now and then being the age of when someone was born, I think it does put into a lot of perspective. And so I think I'll have even more perspective whenever I'm in my 60s, like my own father. And I think two things can be true at the same time, where you could be trying to explain the reason why you did something, but it doesn't excuse the behavior, because you did abuse your children and your wife, even if at the time what you thought was right. And I think that is a really complicated emotion, especially for humans to reconcile. I abused my family, but I also loved my family, but also I was abused as a kid and don't want to acknowledge it. But then, you know, and so I think it's just like a really big whirlwind of emotions. And so Jacob really letting this out, probably the first time in his entire life, like writing these things down. I think he was also starting to understand himself better and kind of realizing what he did, but also having struggle with it and then going back into his ego a lot. It's like, oh, that's just what men did back then, so it's fine, or things like that. And so I think it was an excuse, and it also was kind of like a revelation for him to admit the things that he did. And I thought it was really, really interesting the way that it was written. And that's why I liked Jacob sometimes, and then absolutely was like appalled. And that's why I think it was just such a good character, um, how it was written, because it really made me feel like I was reading a letter from a real person, who really did those things, I guess.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. Michael and Grace, I totally agree with everything that you said, and um, I do think that sometimes people use things like this as excuses. Um, I don't think that that's always the truth, and that for Jacob's sake, there was just so much external pressures on him and societal norms. Um, that while it can seem like an excuse at times, um, at least to him, it was really unavoidable.
Yeah, I agree with all of you. I do think it's very easy to get so caught up in your empathy for someone that you're willing to excuse their bad behavior. And I do think that at times Jacob definitely teeters over into excusing his behavior. But I think what saves him, at least towards the end, well, I'll say what saves him throughout all of his letters is even as he's writing his letters, he's having a little bit of internal growth as he is reflecting on all that he's done. In the beginning, he very much has the attitude of, I definitely wasn't abusive because all a father and a husband is meant to be as a provider. And I definitely provided for you guys. So everything else that you guys wanted, it isn't really my responsibility to give you that. But towards the end, he begins to realize, actually, I should have been there for you more emotionally. I should have been a better husband. I shouldn't have, abused your mother when she was drinking. I should have asked her what was wrong. Because I think he acknowledges at one point that he never even asked her what was wrong. Um, Although she very clearly is struggling with something, which caused her drinking. Um, and also, I think that um, in Jacob's mind, at least in the beginning, his abuse was love because he was trying to control them and mold them into what society wanted. And that would, in turn, grant their safety. I think that's reflected a lot in his mother because she wasn't willing to conform to what it means to be a mother or a wife or a woman. That ultimately led to her death. And I think that perhaps that same fear. Uh, was in Jacob's mind with Rachel. Like maybe she would get herself into some sort of like life-changing situation or life-ending situation if she wasn't the dutiful housewife that she is quote unquote made to be. Um, so yeah. Now, I guess I'm curious, do you think this book is more so written for parents or for children? Or I guess fathers or sons, but even outside of men, parents or children.
Just because of how one-sided it is, I lean towards like more for parents. That's just like an initial, like off the top of my head processing, because I don't know that I really thought about this, but it's a really good question. So thank you.
Yeah, I love this question. To me, maybe it was written for like sons or for children, the children of um, these circumstances, just because I feel like whenever I have, and it's, I guess, mostly like TV or movies rather than books, but whenever I've watched some, certain books or certain shows and movies about queer people or trans people specifically, like you can always tell who the audience is meant to be based on where it begins, and like the explanation of like maybe people having to get comfortable with trans people or explaining this type of um, experience. That is always like I can always tell. I'm like, like this is not for me. Like this is an audience, different audience is for this. Um, like I'm not sure if you all have heard. There's and now I just forgot her name, but there's a new show with this very what is her name? Oh, Laverne Cox. Laverne Cox has a new show. It's like a sitcom, and I started to watch it, and I was like, this is not for me. Um, but I think that this is like starting from a different place where it very much is covering maybe what sons are hoping to hear from their fathers, and this is kind of what the author said at the beginning of his letter. Maybe because it is being written by the son, a queer black man, that it really is really meant for that audience.
Yeah, I really agree with what Soul said, just because of the author's letter at the beginning and like why this was being written. Um, but yeah, I think it could go both ways depending on the lens with which you read the book. So I'm not a parent, so I think it would be interesting to have a parent read this book and see what lens they thought it would be written for. Um, because I'm just reading it from the lens of, like Isaac's point of view, I guess, and that it's kind of hard for me to see what that would look like from a older parent's point of view. And I think one part of the letter, which could, I think, make it go both ways depending on the perspective of the reader, would be it's like the last paragraph, which really kind of struck me, was if they, like, fathers, had been allowed to dream, they might have expected sons who are not carbon copies of themselves. They might have imagined boys in all their glory dancing before the world without shame. Um, and so I think it's a really interesting question. Um, and I think it's really hard to answer. And I like that it's hard to answer.
Yeah, I would say it's a very difficult question. I think it's a teachable moment for both parents and children. I think, like Grace said, I'm not a parent, so I don't know how I would react to it if I were a parent, or especially if I was this kind of parent. But as a child, it allows me to empathize with parents like this in a way that I probably wouldn't have without this story. Um, and based on reviews that I've read from people who are not queer, parents or not parents, they are able to empathize with their own children, or at least able to understand ways in which they perpetuate these same behaviors. And I think that's beautiful. I think this book works in both ways. Um, mm, yeah. Now, I think I know the answer to this question, but I will ask it anyway. The author did write a sequel to this novel. It came out late last month, from Isaac's perspective. Are you guys interested in reading that, or do you want to end this story here? Of course, not reading it now, but at some point.
I would be interested in reading it at some point in the future. I do like kind of like breaking up some of like the heavier stuff, maybe like not back to back, which I know you're already aware of and probably planning. But yeah, I mean, I would be open to it more than some of the other sequels that we have known about.
Yeah, same here. I would like to sit with this book for longer, but definitely wanting to read the new book later.
Yeah, same.
Same.
Cool. Okay. And as a last little fun question, I'll ask, even though the book is titled Don't Cry for Me, did you cry?
No. I did not, but it was very powerful, and I'm also not a crier either, so.
I did not cry specifically from the book, but like Grace, I don't have super strong emotions very often, so that may be why, or I don't cry very often. You don't want to put words in someone's mouth.
Yeah, same to both of them. I did definitely like my eyes like swelled up at the very like from the author's note that I was like, oh my god, what roller coaster are we about to go into? That already set the mood for the story. And then at the very end, in the last maybe like couple of paragraph, that I also started to get kind of choked up.
Real, I did not cry either. But I think it's because I kind of like, yeah, read my fair share of books like these. So it kind of just, yeah. But it was very powerful.
Yeah, I also, well, I read this book twice. I'm also not someone who's a big crier. There's only been one book I've ever read in my entire life that's made me cry, like sob. So to get me to do that is very difficult. But I will say that when I read this book for the first time, reading that last letter, um, I did get teary, like I'm not teary eyed, but I did get misty. I didn't cry, no tears shed, but my eyes were definitely swelling with a little bit of water. Um, so yeah. Okay, well, that's all that's in my notes. Before we move on to discuss our books for next month, does anyone have any last minute things to say, questions, characters they want to talk about, plot lines? And Arian, I know you said you want to take a back seat, but just in case you want to share, is there anything that you want to say?
I go ahead, Arian. Sorry.
No, I'm just gonna, um, yeah, no, I really identified with uh, Isaac because, yeah, during the book, I considered or like I thought about showing my parents a book because I just recently came out, like probably less than a year ago, and I feel like having them read the book might, give them some insight into what I experienced while growing up, but I don't think I'm ready to be that vulnerable yet. And yeah, no. Um, oh, yeah. Next book, love it. Okay, go ahead, Michael. Sorry.
Oh, I just had two quick things. One that kind of struck me because it's like come up in other things, and one that I thought was funny. Um, I did. It seemed to me like there was a big difference, like in the way Rachel Jacob approached things that I thought sort of fell on these like Rachel coming from the city and Jacob coming from a really rural area, and Rachel just having more experience and exposure to people that are probably a little bit different from herself in a way that Jacob never got until very, very late in life. So that kind of like sat with me a lot through the whole book. And the other thing, if anyone's a baker, I know Johnathan is, but if anyone is a baker, please go back and check the scene where Jacob is learning how to make a cake from his grandma, because it is not the way you make a cake, and I was just cracking up the whole time. But it is a very strange recipe where you essentially like make Play-Doh and then add milk to it. So go back and check that out. It's a lot closer to the beginning of the book, but I couldn't get over that and was just like busting out laughing the whole.
Yeah, that part of the book was definitely funny. I think I didn't really uh it didn't stick out to me as strange too much because Jacob says that he doesn't remember the recipe. So I figured maybe he's just like writing what he does remember about making it, but it's obviously not exactly how you would make the cake. But yeah, it was definitely funny. What were you gonna say, so?
Yeah, I think that we maybe touched upon these points kind of throughout, but I really appreciated having this story be also centered around like Black queerness and maybe Black manhood, because that's a perspective that we don't always get to read about. So I think, like Grace, you had mentioned before, that scene in the bookstore where the white woman was wearing that shirt that was very proud of her daughter, and how Jacob himself said maybe that's like a white people thing, like they get to have these freedoms and Black people don't. So I also really enjoyed the exploration that the author had for that topic. Yeah.
Hey, anything else, or can I move on? Okay. Well, considering the fact that March is one of our longer months, I do want to take advantage of that and kind of chip away just a bit at our reading list. We're currently at over 400 books, and I do want to kind of get through them. So we're going to be meeting twice next month. Of course, the books will be shorter. One of them is like 70 or so pages. The other one is like 280. As always, I will pop the links to the description for each book in the chat. Give me just a second. Um, and if the idea of meeting twice in 1 month is overwhelming for you, don't worry. You're welcome to come to either one. You're welcome to come to both. Um, Preferably don't come to neither, but that's a choice too, if that's what you want to do. So yeah, the first book is called Black Queer Hoe. It is a poetry novel, sorry, poetry collection. Um, I don't know if anyone else who wasn't here for our discussion of Homies by Danez Smith has ever read any of their work, but this author of Black Queer Hoe is a very close personal friend of Danez Smith. Um, and so I'm assuming that the work will be very similar. So if you liked Homies, then I'm sure you'll like this book. Um, and the second book is called From the Belly. It is a like maritime nautical horror novel. Very short, of course, but the description reminds me a lot of Moby Dick and Call of Cthulhu. So if you're a fan of H.P. Lovecraft or of Moby Dick, then I'm sure you'll like that as well. Um, Read those descriptions and then, of course, let me know what you two think. You all think, not you two. Sorry.
They seem awesome. I'm excited.
Yeah, they both look really good.
Yeah, ditto.
So true. Especially from the belly. It seems so cool.
Cool. So I was thinking we would meet on the second Sunday of March and then the last Sunday. The second would be March 16th, and we would read Black Queer Hoe, since of course it is the shorter book. And again, it's poetry. So if you don't want to finish it, you just want to read a few of the poems and then come and discuss that, that's fine. There's no pressure to finish it. So that'll be on the 16th. I'm assuming at noon, unless anyone has any objections to that. Just give me a thumbs up if that's okay. 12 PST, of course, whatever time it is where you are. Cool. And we'll read from the belly on the 30th, the last Sunday, since it's, of course, a little bit longer. Also at 12 PST. Thumbs up again if that's cool. Good. And reading from the belly on the 30th works perfect because the 31st is Trans Day of Remembrance. Sorry, Trans Day of Visibility. And from the belly's author is trans. So perfect. Okay. Before I let you guys go, does anyone have any last minute questions, comments, concerns they want to share about this book, about next month's book, about the club, anything?
I just really appreciate today's meeting, and I like the energy with all of the reactions. It definitely kept me like hyped up a little bit. So thank you guys. I always love coming to these.
You're welcome. And a special shout out, of course, to Grace. Thank you for sharing so much of your personal life. That was amazing. And I think we all needed that. So thank you so much. Okay, well, I hope to see you guys sometime next month, if not both times. And until then, take care of yourselves. And of course, enjoy the rest of your February. Bye-bye.
Awesome.
Thanks,
Thank
Jonathan.
you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye, guys.